Good evening, everyone. I want to say my apologies for not being able to be here in person with you tonight. My schedule's such that I need to be away, but I still wanted to be able to continue in our discussion of our book on Christ and Culture with Richard Niebuhr. And just to kind of reset for us at the beginning of this evening, we have, over the past couple weeks, defined Christ and the different expressions of how we have seen and experienced Jesus in our own lives and in our own faith, and also have explored what culture means. And particularly, we have followed an understanding of culture as this entity that exists between the power of the state and the power of religion or the church to bring about enforcement, that the culture governs itself more from the bottom up, from the mores, the folkways, and the values that are part of a larger community. And last week, we began to frame the 5 types that Niebuhr uses in his book, with the 2 that are on the poles, the Christ against culture and the Christ of culture. And these 2 poles represent the extremes of our typology. And now we get into the work of the 3 entities in the center. And those 3 are where the majority of us live out our faith, in trying to wrestle with how are we faithful to the Christ who has called us and to the culture in which we live. And the 3 ways that Niebuhr does this in his typology is the Christ and culture in paradox, on the one end closer to that of the Christ against culture, and then the Christ above culture that is closer to the Christ of culture on the other end, and then in the center we have Christ as the transformer of culture. Now, what's important here for us to remember as we move into these 3, where many of us live out our life and faith, is that the Christ against culture and the Christ and culture in paradox take a dimmer view of humanity or the culture. Whereas on the other end, with the Christ of culture or the Christ above culture, you have a more positive view of culture. And there in the center is Christ as transformer of culture, where there is a belief that the culture is infected by sin and Christ transforms the culture. You hear overtones of this even in the mission statement of our United Methodist Church. The mission of the United Methodist Church is to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. That's it. That is our mission statement. That is why we exist. That is why we are here. That is why we do what we do. Within that statement, against these 3 forms that we will be exploring tonight through the video, and then next week we'll continue into our discussion, we have religious practice. And what I want to do is kind of begin to frame this with a broader discussion that helps us begin to unlock these 3 that are in the middle of the typology. When we think of religion, we think of Christ with regard to culture. There's certain elements that transcend all culture. Big questions like, why do we die? Why is there this feeling of guilt that I have? Why do I have this sense of shortcoming? Why is there suffering in the world? Every generation has to contend with those matters. They are the ultimate issues of life. We're wrestling with them now. Future generations will do so. And it's just part of human being. Now, when it comes to exercising our faith, there are really 2 ways that this happens. The first is in public worship. And if you look at the corporate body that gathers, you can begin to see how people express and live out their belief. Worship practices really do matter. We can learn more about the social, socioeconomic makeup of a group. If you take worship in, let's say, an Episcopal church, you're going to find a very heady experience. You'll find written liturgy. You're going to find an order-structured worship service. If you move to a Pentecostal service, you may find more participatory service where there's movement and action and energy. And there is a correlation in some ways with our daily life. If you look at upper middle class professional types that are often working with their minds, they tend to worship more with their minds. Whereas if you are working every day with your body and you are in a more mobile type of vocation, you tend to bring that into your worship life as well and worship more with your body. Sometimes it's very uncomfortable for United Methodists to begin to move around too much because we're pretty heady folks. But other traditions, it's not a second thought given to expressing yourself by moving around in the sanctuary or dancing or lifting your hands or other aspects that connect your daily life with the Sunday morning or Sunday night experience. So public worship is one of the ways that we begin to see how groups and really people within groups can begin to move through our life together. The second, and this one perhaps has more bearing on our discussion, is with daily moral behavior. Sure, we gather on Sunday morning as the church, having been scattered, now assembled. But the church scatters at the end of the service, and Monday through Saturday, we go through the course of our days with the beliefs and the teachings of the group guiding, hopefully exercising some authority over our behavior. In other words, how is our daily life governed? And how we view Christ as the Christ against culture or the Christ of culture, or these other three that we're going to start to unpack. There's Christ above culture, Christ in culture and paradox, and even Christ as transformer of culture, gives us a bit of the lens through which we look at the world, at our culture, at how we navigate those realities that we have to face every single day. This is not just a sin problem. This is more than that. I used sin earlier as the Christ as transformer of culture, that the culture has been infected by sin, and Christ is to transform the culture. This can also be issue-oriented, because we can begin to look at those really hot-button issues through the rubrics of these different aspects of the typology. We've just gone through this very divisive election cycle. Here in Florida, we had two of those hot-button issues that faith communities were pulled into. One was around the amendment of marijuana use, and the other was around the amendment on abortion. Those are critical issues for people of faith, for people who are not of some faith expression. But the overriding practices and teachings of the church and faith leaders were pulled into these discussions as voters headed to the ballot box. And there are other issue-oriented differences that the lens through which we tend to view these matters can shape how we experience the cultural dynamics. So there's a social element that is underneath this work. This is the worldview that we hold, and how we see Christ is in relation to this larger worldview. Your worldview is how you experience and share that context in which we live. Now, this happens in organized religion. We see strong correlation in many places. The whole birds of a feather flock together does seem to hold when it comes to how people express their beliefs. I've used the example of the Fundamentalist Baptist Church. You're going to have a strong in-group cohesion where people believe the same way and tend to see the world the same way. I would contend that our context here at First United Methodist Church of Panama City is a more diverse gathering where we have a pretty broad view across the entire spectrum of our church family. I've shared with Carl that we have essentially 3 churches under one roof. We gather at 8:15 and 9:30 and 10:45, and on occasion there's some mixing and mingling. But when we look across the 3 services and then we look into our broader constituency, we have a very wide array of thought. And yet, in a beautiful witness to this community, we are here together and in relationship with one another. And that's a remarkable thing that's not to be taken for granted, that we can see things differently, perhaps, and yet stay in relationship. This past week, I saw an article by John Archibald. John was raised in a Methodist parsonage as a preacher's kid during the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s in North Alabama. And he penned an article for AL.com that showed an exchange he had with 2 of his readers. They did not necessarily agree on all things, nor would you expect them to. There's a difference between unity and uniformity. But John said he was struck, wrote that he was struck in just engaging in the conversation how much they did agree with when it comes to how they see the world. And I think there's something of value in this environment for us to be able to sit down and talk, even if it means that we don't necessarily agree when we get up from the conversation. We have at least been able to see another person's vantage point as it pertains to how they see the world. And that is the lens, again, through which they are looking. One of the reasons why we're doing this course is to help you, either in your relationships with family or with your friends or your Sunday school classmates or your colleagues or coworkers, to be able to understand that when you engage people in these discussions, they're tending to look at the world through one of these 5 ways that we experience Christ and the culture in which we inhabit. So if there's any takeaway, maybe it is that you go to your colleague and you can begin to pick up that she is one of these who sees Christ against culture. And there's that tension that's built in, and that creates the lens through which she's looking. You may not be at that place personally, but now you have some idea of how to engage that discussion. Or you may find a family member who's a Christ of culture. Or, as I think we'll see over tonight and the next few days, our next couple sessions, that these 3 in the middle really are where it kind of is where the rubber hits the road for us in sorting out our faithfulness to Christ in relation to the culture. Then, aside from the social piece, there is this invisible religion, and that is your own experience of God. That's completely private. It's between the ears. You experience this in the congregation, but then you go from the congregation to begin to wrestle in your own way with how the teachings and the precepts and the interactions that you've had with others shape your personal views of the world as a whole, and ultimately your relation to Christ. So when we look at the dimensions of religion, there are also ways in which we have a primary focus. Now, we can credit a guy named Ninian Smart for this work. He labeled 4 different expressions for this. Ritual. Ritual would be a repeated pattern of behavior. Think of the Roman Catholic Mass. Do you know that a Roman Catholic priest will conduct the Mass even when no one is present? Now, that's a little different than Sunday night when I was, growing up at First United Methodist Church in Weewha-Hitchcock, if we had a couple of people show up on Sunday night, they would go, well, y'all want to have church tonight? And there would be this little back and forth, and a lot of times we'd just turn off the lights and go home. Not for a Roman Catholic priest who's charged with conducting the Mass. The Mass itself is what's central, not the participants who may or may not be there. It's the ritual. It's that structured pattern of behavior over time. And for people who have that viewpoint, it's the ritual that matters most. It's why events like Vatican II were such a tremendous upheaval in reshaping the accessibility of the Mass to people when shifting from Latin to English or to the native languages there, because that messed with the ritual. There's this old book, Who Moved My Cheese? When we get into established patterns of behavior, we don't like changes. My staff will tell you, I can handle disappointments, I cannot handle surprises. And when we begin to change the ritual, if we are very ritualistic in our ways of doing things, then we can see that pushback almost immediately. So one expression of religious behavior is this idea of ritual. The second would be around doctrine. The doctrinal person is one who has constructed foundational beliefs, tenets, the foundational stories where the focus is on the right teaching. The big word for that is orthodoxy, right teaching. And that really is found in our Presbyterian, John Calvin kind of stream of Christianity. You can follow the teachings of Calvin to the letter. The sovereignty of God, the total depravity of man, the divine election of the human being, the tulip, if you grew up in the Presbyterian tradition. And it was about understanding the right teaching, and anything outside of that was heterodoxy, was incorrect teaching. And for some, their primary lens through which they look at life and faith and relation to Christ is about the right teaching, the right belief. The third expression that we see is in ethical behavior, the daily moral behavior that governs conduct and character. You can think of us Wesleyans, the holiness tradition, and in particularly the smaller rural communities that still use gossip as a form of social control, where to act outside the norm, to violate the culture, brings about the wrath of the community. Now, that goes beyond the right teaching piece. You can have right teaching and wrong action all day long. But now we're putting the teaching in relation to the action. And sometimes the action becomes judged not necessarily based on the teaching, but what the expectations of the community are. So you can begin to see this wrestling once again of Christ and culture that's at the overarching part of our work here with Niebuhr. How much does the action that may or may not be approved by the community actually look like the teachings of Christ? Depends on the issue at hand and the lens through which you look at Christ's teachings. The last that we've touched on a little bit is the experiential aspect. Now, as we've noted, experience is unimpeachable. If I have an experience, that's mine. You have an experience, that's yours. Who am I to say that your experience is invalid? Maybe a possible way, but we need to hold that thought, because it's more about the personal encounter with God that one has had along the way. If you have any friends who are from the twice-born traditions, as we would call them, they have had some change, some encounter with Christ, and as a result have made a change in their lives that have set them on a new path to go a new direction. Now, that path can be evaluated over and against the teachings of the church, the traditions of the church, the scripture of the church, and that begins theological reflection, theological reasoning that all of us do. We all are doing that work, and often we do it subconsciously or even unconsciously, but you still are reflecting theologically. If you've ever asked the question, why me, Lord, you're doing theological work. Now, all four religious groups have these dimensions. There's a ritual, there's a doctrine, there's ethical expectations, as well as one's own experience. But within each of our traditions, there's going to be one of those that has more emphasis than the others. And that lens gives us some idea of how the larger group may view and experience Christ in relation to their community as a whole. So I want to pause right there and kind of frame our time as we go forward. What we're going to do is we're going to look a little bit more at world building and world maintenance, world view, and have some insight as to how those two aspects begin to frame the way that we look at these three in the center: the Christ and culture and paradox on the one end, Christ above culture on the other, and then Christ as transformer of the culture there in the center of the typologies. So I want to pick up around this idea of world building and world view. Now, from the time we have been in this world, we have been shaped, we've been molded. That starts with our family of origin. It moves through our formative years and childhood and adolescence, and that includes our friend groups, that includes our sports teams or our dance or our extracurriculars, all of those groups that begin to come into our lives. And one of those is the church, and how the church can shape our understanding of the world, of how it works, of how it operates. It's an interesting paradox that the parents of very young children have more influence over those young children at that time than they will at any other point in time, and that as you age and as you mature and as they go into school or they graduate or they move into the workforce, the influence the parent has is less and less and less. And other influences begin to shape the way that we might see the world. And those tensions are felt when children age and they begin to question the ways that they were raised over and against other things that they hear about. And it's just part of that maturation that we all go through. But you only get to that point when you have this idea of world building. So the first half of life really is about world building, particularly those formative years through adolescence and early adulthood. Groups of people combine to build our worldview. So how you see the world today is the compilation of the influence of groups that you were involved with, subjected to along the way. And it's this cumulative effect that has shaped your understanding. And if it's happened to you, it's happened to everybody else. And then you begin to listen to people, and you might understand why they maybe are averse to debt, or why they fear being alone, or why being away from family causes anxiety. And you can understand a bit more of these stories because of the worldview, the world that has been built, that shapes the way that we see life. We see it more acutely during times of difficulty. This has been a difficult time for our nation. And we see that there are different views with regard to the larger culture. You can look at this data that's coming in post-election. You can see it county by county, and you can see a clear urban-rural divide that is emerging. And it's not just an urban-rural piece, it's the thought worlds that come with that particular dichotomy that we see today. Just one example. We can go down race, we can go down class, we can go down region of the country, you name it. And there we can begin to parse out different views of the world, different ways that the understanding of the world has been built. But family and parents have the most influence when it comes to world building. Religion plays a partial part, for better or worse, based on our personal experience and how much or how little our own families were involved in childhood or in our childhood. And this is fascinating because as we look at the larger question of Christ and culture, we're seeing fewer and fewer people involved in the life of the church today. That is going to have generational impacts. We already say tongue-in-cheek about the Christmas Easter Society, those that we see on Christmas and Easter that for some reason feel compelled to be in worship on those days. But you rarely will see them at worship on any other Sunday or special service through the course of the year. It's a degree of connection, some awareness of the larger role of organized religion, but in the daily participation, there's very much lacking. The fastest growing group in our nation today are the nones, no religious affiliation. This spring, we're going to offer the Alpha course. Now, Alpha is the basic introduction to the Christian faith. Topics like, who is Jesus? Why do I need to read the Bible? How do I pray? Does God heal today? Tough questions. But the course is designed not as much for people in the church, though everyone's going to be welcome. It's designed for people who are not in the church to be able to explore the Christian faith in a way where those of us in the church sit with their questions. Because whether they are in the church or outside the church, these larger questions of human being plague every person from every generation. I'm really excited that we're going to be hosting the Alpha course. It'll be on Monday nights in February and March next year. 6 to 7:45, I think, is the time. And each week there'll be a communal meal. There'll be a brief video or short presentation. And then there's small group discussion. My hope is that all of you and everyone in this church will find that one person in your family, at work, in any of your social circles, that you find yourself in these conversations of faith. Or maybe you find them asking these big questions, and you would really hope that they might take that next step. I want them to take that next step. If we're in Bay County with 40% of our population involved in a faith community, that means 6 out of 10 people, 6 out of 10, no church affiliation. What better way for us to begin to walk with them, hopefully to a relationship with Jesus Christ, than through something like the Alpha course. So stay tuned, you'll hear more about it. Very excited that you all kind of get to hear this first, because what we will do here is hopefully sit with people who are asking questions, and in the asking questions, maybe they find community, maybe they find encouragement, support. They might just find a relationship with Jesus Christ. Now, we build the world that we look at. we live in, we see each and every day. Then we have to maintain it. World maintenance. We have to pass on our worldview to the next generation. We said a couple weeks ago, we're one generation away from the faith becoming obsolete. We do this in our families. We've got 3 in our house, and when we brought them to the altar for baptism, we pledged to raise them in the church. You all pledged to walk alongside them. Every Sunday that we baptize a baby, I walk them up and down the aisle and say, this child has no idea what we've done to them, but they're going to learn what it means to be a Christian from all of you. And so in that way, they become part of Christ's family. And we will teach the next generation through socialization. They'll be in children's church. They'll sit and worship. They may be in the children's choir, part of the youth group. And by being here and by being part of those activities and programs, they'll learn. They'll learn how we do church and be shaped by that. We're a creedal church. We talked about creeds. One of the basic things that you learn in our tradition is the Apostles' Creed. It's a way to give basic tenets of the faith to people to be able to recite when others ask, well, what do you believe? Well, I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. Believe in Jesus Christ, His only Son, our Lord. Believe in the Holy Spirit. Believe in the communion of saints. Believe in the resurrection. And there we begin to outline the tenets of our faith. So socialization is the way by which we raise our young people up. We also can socialize those new to the group. Those who come in begin to understand why we do what we do and how we do what we do when we do a good job of explaining both of those. We do a really good job with the how. I think we have a lot of work to do with the why. And if we can do the why well, we'll connect everyday faith and life with what happens here on Sunday mornings in our primary worship experience. The other way we maintain the world is through social control. The pressure the group brings toward the individual. The group enforces the rules. This is the culture. Just, for example, how long would you let someone talk loudly in a theater before you would tap them on the shoulder and say, hey, quiet? Probably not long, because the group is there to watch a movie. They're not there to listen to someone's cell phone conversation. The group has made the determination that that type of behavior is wrong. It's an error. It doesn't conform. That's just a minor example, but it's an example of how the larger group, the culture, begins to determine the ways that we should act when we are in the whole. No one can come in and shout fire in a crowded theater. Why? Because that becomes a safety hazard. It's also very disruptive to do so when there is no danger to those gathered. So the most common form of social control is guilt. We have a good number of folks struggling with guilt and shame. And in some ways, the church has had a part in that by determining the actions that are right and wrong. And we do view things as sinful. Sin means missing the mark, means that we fail to do right every single time. We can do that through action. We can do that through inaction. But it is a reminder that we have not lived in the ways that we should at all points and all times. There's a brokenness that exists. We have this idea, there's sin, but in some ways we have made this erroneous determination that some sins are weightier than others. Sin is sin. What I will say is the consequence of the sin may be greater, may be more disruptive. But no one sin is greater than the other. However, the impacts of sinful action may be such that the consequences are much more detrimental than they were perhaps if the impacts were not as significant. The most severe form of punishment that we can enact when it comes to the culture is ostracism. In terms of religion, that would be maybe excommunication. In the Roman Catholic tradition, I've heard of some Presbyterians voting people out of the membership. We've talked about the Amish and shunning as three examples of church discipline, church order. It does exist in the United Methodist Church as well. We have processes by which charges can be brought against clergy and against laity. And on occasion, there are cases that move through. When I was a district superintendent, I had a layperson file a complaint against another layperson. By discipline, I was the one who had to oversee the complaint process. And in our British system that we've inherited, we have this blurring of executive and judicial authority. So as a district superintendent, I served as an extension of the bishop's office. Bishop Leland, who I served with, said to me when I was appointed, said, "Now you are the Bishop of Pensacola in my absence." Well, when it comes to a complaint, a formal complaint written by one layperson against another layperson, the discipline says the superintendent becomes the one that presides over the complaint process. So my role shifts from being executive level leadership now to judicial leadership. Best example I can use, many of you in here will remember the Andy Griffith Show, Mayberry. There were these episodes where Andy would be gathered as the sheriff there, and somebody would come in and they would have a concern, and they would say, "Well, I want to talk to the judge," or "I want to talk to the justice of the peace." And you know what Andy did? He took the sheriff tag and he turned it around and he placed it back down, and now he was the justice of the peace. That really captures our own system, where our bishops and as an extension of the office, the superintendents hold both executive and judicial power. Now, about 95% of the time, we see them in the executive role, akin to kind of a governor, if you will. But there is this other aspect of the work of our bishops that is judicial. Now, there is a check on the judicial authority of our bishops. Bishops make decisions on church law. However, that is subject to review by our judicial council, which is essentially the Supreme Court of the United Methodist Church. I have actually presented briefs at the Judicial Council at different points along the way. It's a fascinating type of work, and very few ever get the chance to do that, and it's part of our polity, it's part of our structure. So even we, alongside the Roman Catholics, the Presbyterians, or the Amish, have ways that we negotiate and navigate the conflicts that may arise that are just part of life together. The other part that I want to mention is with regard to social legitimation. When we start to look at these three in the center here that are kind of the middle, where most of us live out our lives, part of what's underneath these three types that we'll really dive into is justifying our own behaviors and lifestyles. Now, on the poles, we add the Christ against culture, so really nothing of our behavior could be justified if it's believed to have stood against the teachings of Christ. We pointed out the flaws of this in that the world itself has been created by God. So how can we live in this world that God has created and called good when we believe everything counter to Christ is bad? The other side of that, the other pole, is that the Christ of culture is such that they're almost one and the same. That there's that Christ kind of takes on the culture in that time, and seeing any distinction between the two becomes a challenge. So those two exist on the poles. But for the majority of us living in this area where we have these three other types, Christ in culture and paradox, the Christ above culture, Christ as transformer of culture, there's still going to be this larger need of justifying our own behaviors and our own values. And religion is at the heart of this, the culture is at the heart of this. For little boys and girls who are sitting there over their plate protesting what you put in front of them, I might be speaking from experience. A parent might say, God loves little boys that eat their green beans. Well, does God really care if the boy eats the green beans or not? I don't know. But I know that it's sometimes used to coerce the child to think I need to eat the green beans here so that God will be more pleased with me. In the larger society as adults, we will say, in God we trust, one nation under God. I'll revisit the example of prohibition. Religion was used to sell the whole prohibition movement. Pulpits across this country, preachers gathered to deride the whole notion of alcohol. And that really was a significant part of our early history. The church's relationship with alcohol is still one that's tenuous in places. Some traditions have no issues whatsoever. Others, they have great concern. But if you look at the wedding feast at Cana, for example, a cultural event in Jesus' time, in John chapter 2, it's hard to say that Christianity teaches prohibition when Jesus himself makes about 180 gallons worth of wine. And yet there is this belief that we're opposed to Christianity. Now, you might have heard that around Methodists, and I'll just kind of speak into that for a moment here as we close this part. United Methodists do have a prohibition against alcohol, but not for the reasons you might think. The prohibition against alcohol is tied to a larger social ethic. What is used in the production of alcohol? Well, that would be elements like wheat and barley. That's important because wheat and barley are also used for what? Bread products. John Wesley believed that so long as there were people going hungry who did not have the basics to eat, that bread, that wheat and barley that could be used for baking and making bread should not be diverted for making alcoholic beverages. And so that exists not from an individual restriction against the consumption of alcohol. If you read Wesley's journals, he includes alcohol as one of his medicinal remedies. If you read his journal, he actually dabbled in practicing medicine. Now, I wouldn't go follow all of his advice, but you did see someone who was concerned about the whole of being, and alcohol was prescribed as a remedy for some ailments by John Wesley. But he was very much opposed to diverting the resources of wheat and barley from people who could use those just for basic sustenance if the outcome was such that alcoholic beverages were produced. So again, the tension of Christ and culture. Christ makes this wine at the wedding at Cana of Galilee, and yet in our own history just 100 years ago, we're seeing a prohibition movement that was so effective that it still has vestiges of an impact today. Religion will meet social needs, and we know that. It provides the network for us to have friends. Many of you have a lot of your contacts that you interact with daily because of being connected to the church. And some of these people may or may not be very deeply religious, but there's a communal aspect that comes from being together. Duke Divinity School, Duke Medical School, several years ago put out a study that showed that being connected to a faith community increases one's lifespan because you have better well-being. And then beyond just those communal social needs that we all have as people, there really is this sense that the church is where we have genuinely felt religious needs met. We do wrestle with those big questions. We do meet the spiritual needs. Religion stands in those gap moments of transition when there's a birth, or when there's a confirmation, or there's a wedding, or there's a death, or any of the other disruptive events such as a divorce or some trauma that occurs. Religion is there. And so the religious expression of Christ in the culture is multi-dimensional and not just religious in nature. And these three ways of Christ in culture in paradox, Christ above culture, and Christ as transformer of the culture are where we're going to sort all this out as a majority of those who have lives that are oriented toward the things of God to the things of Christ. So we're going to pick up with one final segment here. So as we finish this evening, I want to take a moment and just kind of frame things with regard to these three types that are in the center of Niebuhr's typology. The first is the Christ and culture in paradox. Now, our nature as human beings is to see things kind of in a dichotomous sense. It's black, it's white, it's either or. And Christ and culture in paradox really does capture this idea of dualism. And Christians live in the world, which we do, but oblivious to it. Meaning that we rest on tradition, we rest on our faith, and we are waiting for the coming of God's kingdom. Now on the other end, we have the synthesis model of Christ above culture, that Christians live in both realms, that we live lives that try to bring these two realms of the culture and the kingdom together and assert Christ's dominance over all the culture. And then the one in the middle is that Christians endeavor to convert and redeem the culture for the glory of God. Now I suspect that there's probably a mixture in these lenses through which we look, depending on maybe the issue at hand that we are addressing, maybe even the ways that we're navigating relationships with one another may move us toward places that we might be oblivious to it. We're coming up on Thanksgiving, and we always say you don't necessarily talk about religion and politics, but I suspect many of your families are all religious in some way. And so you get to this place where you have the Christ and culture in paradox, where we live in the world, we're going to be together, we're going to be eating turkey, but maybe for safety and civility reasons, we're just kind of oblivious to those dynamics for a time, and then we go on our way. Very much what happens at our house when all the Pridgeon group gets together. Even though several of us work in the life of the church, we just kind of set that aside because it's Thanksgiving and it's better to forego any of those broad discussions. The Christ above culture would assert that Christ is over these matters and just go ahead and put them all on the table and have this discussion. And chances are we probably would not move anyone toward any closer agreement. Not that that necessarily should be the goal, but we would acknowledge Christ's general overarching sense of reign, while perhaps finding some disagreements relative to doctrines or beliefs or practices that exist. And you can get in some spirited theological debates and discussions. We do. We've done that for a couple thousand years. You do it today over matters like baptism or the Lord's Supper or doctrinal teaching. That's part of getting groups from diverse viewpoints together. Christ is above the cultural dynamics, and then the cultural pieces are wrestled there within. And then the larger conversionist piece, the conversionist influence, going into the world to redeem the cultural life for God's glory. And each of these positions really goes back to that Genesis story that we spoke of. Remember a couple of weeks ago where we talked about, is your framework Genesis 1, where creation is good, and then there's the fall, or is your framework beginning with Genesis 3, where it begins with the fall? And notions of creation, fall, and redemption are all part of this larger dynamic. So, to kind of wrap things up for tonight, because I want to let you all go a bit early so that you're not having to just watch this on television, and I also want to frame this for next week. We're going to do the deeper dive next week into these three that are in the middle. So hopefully, as you've gotten your books, you've been able to pick up on the reading. I know some are just getting those, so don't worry if you haven't had a chance to see those through. But we are going to look at Christ above culture, Christ and culture and paradox, and then we're going to take a final look at the Christ and culture as transformer of the larger culture. Each of these positions are trying to stake out some way of navigating life together for us. The Christ above culture is going to work for some synthesis, and you'll see that when you do your reading. So as you look through, look for the ways that it's not this either or, it's not this both and, but more of a biblical New Testament meaning of Christ separating us from the accommodating cultural believer and an appreciation for culture that's both human and divine. Examples like, don't think I've come to abolish the law, as Jesus says in Matthew. I didn't come to abolish it, but I came to fulfill. Well, that changes the tenor somewhat, doesn't it? And so that's a Christ above culture, over those cultural dynamics that have been established by the priest and the priestly imagination, Christ coming to fulfill it. The other side of that is the Christ and culture in paradox, that we see this notion of law, which reveals sin and therefore becomes a means of grace, divine wrath, divine mercy. This dualism. So the synthesis portion tries to set that aside. I didn't come to abolish it, I came to fulfill. The Christ and culture and paradox holds that tension before us of the both and. And then the final piece there is the transformer of culture, that the conversionists who are going to come in, they're most like the dualist. You're for us or against us, it's either or, but there are themes in common with other perspectives as well. And it's the position of the church at the center of the typology. This work of Christ and humanity's work in the culture, they're not isolated in this sense, however, and they carry out the cultural duties faithfully, but don't modify Christ's sharp judgment of the culture. And as we gather next week, we'll kind of parse these out even more so. But in the larger expression of religion, of Christianity, of following Christ, we're really moving into this place where the majority of our people of faith will reside, and the lens through which you look and I look at how we navigate faithfulness to Christ within the culture in which we find ourselves in this particular day in time, in 2024, in this particular part of the world, the United States, in this particular region, the Southeast United States, even here in this part of Northwest Florida called Bay County. And you can move those cultural dynamics down to the very, very micro culture that exists even within each individual congregation. And if you've been members of churches, Elsewhere, you know, every church is different as an expression of the body of Christ amongst the community in which we live and serve. So a broad overview tonight that hopefully sets us up to go into that last part next week on these final three aspects of the typology that will help us round out this study of Niebuhr, of Christ and culture, the five typologies that will better equip you to interact not only with those who are part of our congregation, but also with those in your sphere of influence when you are finding yourself in those discussions around life and faith. Thank you for your time tonight, and thank you for allowing me to come to you in this format and for your faithfulness along the way. We'll look forward to gathering next week, 6 o'clock, and if you have any questions, comments, feel free to email me, let me know. We'll follow up with those certainly next week on anything I might have shared with you tonight. Take care and God bless.